The prisoner's victory could not free. Victory reached Europe before peace did. It came through broken cities, across roads churned into mud by tanks and trucks, past villages where flags appeared in windows before anyone knew who would control the next checkpoint. It came with church bells, with exhausted soldiers leaning against half-tracks, with German columns surrendering by the thousands. It came with the smell of smoke, diesel, wet wool, and something worse drifting from the camps the armies had begun to uncover. For General George S. Patton, victory was never supposed to feel motionless. He had built his war around speed. In North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany, he had treated hesitation as an enemy almost as dangerous as the Wehrmacht. His Third Army had become a weapon of momentum, a steel river pushing through rain, snow, ruins, and resistance. Patton believed wars were won by men who moved faster than fear, faster than bureaucracy, faster than the enemy could understand. But in the spring of 1945, movement began to stop. The enemy was collapsing, yet orders grew more careful. Roads that had carried tanks toward Germany now carried refugees, freed prisoners, surrendering soldiers, and displaced families with nowhere to go. Allied headquarters became less concerned with breakthrough maps and more consumed by zones, boundaries, custody, repatriation, political agreements, and the dangerous question of what Europe would become after Hitler. On paper, the Allies were still united. American, British, and Soviet armies had defeated Nazi Germany together. Their leaders had shaken hands, divided responsibilities, and spoken of reconstruction. But on the ground, in the cold and exhausted middle of Europe, soldiers could feel the alliance changing shape. The war against Germany was ending. The struggle over Europe was beginning. Patton sensed it earlier than many wanted to admit. His distrust of the Soviet Union was not subtle, and it was not always diplomatic. He spoke with the bluntness of a commander who believed political language often concealed military danger. To some, he sounded reckless. To others, he sounded disturbingly clear-eyed. What made him dangerous inside the Allied system was not simply that he distrusted Moscow. It was that he said so when silence was becoming policy. The battlefield had produced a new kind of prisoner. There were German POWs surrendering in vast numbers. There were Allied prisoners liberated from camps. There were slave laborers taken from across Europe. There were concentration camp survivors too weak to stand. There were Soviet citizens who had fought, been captured, collaborated, resisted, fled, or simply survived in places where survival itself had become morally complicated. There were displaced people whose papers were missing, whose countries had shifted beneath them, whose governments no longer existed in any recognizable form. In the last weeks of the war, the map was no longer just geography, it was judgment. Every road led to a question. Who belonged where? Who would be handed over? Who had the right to refuse repatriation? Who counted as an ally, a traitor, a victim, a prisoner, a political burden? The Allied armies had defeated a regime built on racial terror and mass murder. Yet now they stood amid millions of human beings the war had torn from every category that once protected them. Patton's Third Army encountered this human wreckage not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality. Camps, columns, barracks, sick men behind wire, women carrying bundles through shattered towns, children staring from wagons. Soldiers who had survived combat now found themselves guarding people whose past could not be sorted by uniform alone. At places like Ohrdruf, which Patton visited in April 1945, the war revealed a horror even hardened commanders struggled to absorb. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald, and when American forces entered it, they found bodies, survivors, and evidence of systematic cruelty. Patton, who had seen battlefields across 2 world wars, reportedly became physically shaken by what he witnessed. Eisenhower wanted commanders, soldiers, and journalists to see the camps so that no one could later deny what had been found. The photographs would endure. But photographs did not solve what came next. Liberation did not immediately mean safety. For many prisoners and displaced persons, liberation opened another corridor of fear. Some wanted to go home. Some had no home to return to. Some feared the Germans, others feared the Soviets. Some accounts from the period describe people resisting repatriation because return could mean interrogation, punishment, exile, or death. The evidence varied by group and circumstance, and historians still separate documented policy from rumor, panic, and battlefield confusion. But the fear itself was real enough to shape the atmosphere in the camps. The Allies had agreements to honor. The Soviet Union wanted its citizens returned. Western commanders were under pressure to maintain cooperation with Moscow, while the final defeat of Germany was still unfolding, and while huge numbers of Western prisoners were in Soviet-liberated areas. Repatriation became a machinery of files, trucks, guards, interpreters, and tense negotiations. For Patton, machinery without moral clarity was intolerable. He had always believed in command as personal force. A commander saw, decided, moved. But the post-war world did not obey that rhythm. It was built from conferences, memoranda, occupation directives, and compromises made far above the soldiers who had to enforce them. Patton could smash through a German defensive line, but he could not smash through Allied policy without destroying his own career and perhaps damaging the alliance itself. That was the trap. The men with rifles had won the war. The men with maps were now dividing the peace. In American headquarters, the atmosphere changed from urgency to unease. Officers who had spent years measuring distance in miles now measured it in zones of occupation. The Soviets were no longer distant partners advancing from the east. They were physically present across rivers, roads, towns, and borders. Their patrols could be seen. Their officers could be met. Their intentions could be guessed at, but not trusted. Patton's fear was not that Germany had been defeated too slowly. It was that victory had stopped too soon. He believed the Western Allies had ended the war with enormous power in their hands, and then hesitated before the next political reality. He saw Soviet control expanding across Eastern Europe, and interpreted it through the instincts of a soldier trained to identify future enemies before they fully formed. In his mind, the Red Army was not merely another Allied force. It was the armed edge of an ideology that would not stop where politicians hoped it would. This view made him both perceptive and dangerous. He was not a diplomat. He was not restrained by the careful language required of coalition politics. He was vain, theatrical, brilliant, impulsive, loyal to his men, contemptuous of weakness, and often blind to the damage his own words could cause. His anti-Soviet warnings would later seem, to some, prophetic. But in 1945, they threatened a fragile peace at the exact moment Allied leaders needed public unity. The crisis was not one dramatic secret order. It was something colder. A system built to win a war was being converted into a system meant to manage consequences no one fully controlled. Inside displaced persons camps, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. People waited beneath roofs patched with scrap wood and canvas. Some clutched papers that proved too little. Others avoided giving names. Translators moved between languages that carried different kinds of fear. American guards, many barely older than the people they watched, were asked to enforce procedures they did not always understand. A soldier could liberate a camp in the morning and guard its gates by night. That contradiction marked the moral confusion of 1945. Patton was not in command of all Allied repatriation policy, and it would be false to place every decision at his feet. The machinery was larger than any one general. It involved agreements among governments, directives from higher command, Soviet pressure, Western anxieties, and the vast administrative nightmare of a destroyed continent. But Patton's presence gives the story its dangerous human center, because he embodied the rage of motion trapped inside political restraint. He wanted clarity where there was compromise. He wanted enemies named before diplomats were ready to name them. He wanted the war's moral energy to continue into the peace, even as Washington and London sought stability, demobilization, and order. By mid-1945, Patton's role had shifted. The general who had chased German armies across Europe became an occupation commander in Bavaria. It was a position that required patience, sensitivity, political discipline, and administrative judgment. These were not the qualities that had made him famous. He was now responsible for governance in a defeated land filled with ruins, former Nazis, survivors, prisoners, displaced persons, hungry civilians, and Allied officials watching for mistakes. Mistakes came. Patton's handling of denazification brought controversy. He believed experienced German administrators were needed to keep society functioning, and he compared the Nazi Party in some comments to political affiliation in a way that shocked many Americans. To him, practical occupation required order first. To critics, this sounded like moral blindness after the camps had shown what Nazism had done. The same general who had been shaken by Ohrdruf now seemed unable or unwilling to speak about German political guilt in the language the moment demanded. This contradiction did not fit neatly into hero worship. Patton could be morally outraged by Nazi atrocity and still dangerously dismissive about the political cleansing required afterward. He could care deeply for soldiers and prisoners while showing contempt for civilian oversight. He could see the Soviet threat with unusual force while misjudging how his own words would sound in a world desperate to end war. The tragedy of Patton in 1945 is not that he was simply right or simply wrong. It is that he belonged to war more completely than he could belong to peace. As the occupation settled over Germany, the liberated world began to harden into blocs. Soviet-backed governments emerged in Eastern Europe. Western leaders grew increasingly alarmed. Former allies began gathering intelligence on one another. Words like cooperation and reconstruction remained in speeches, but suspicion moved beneath them like a second current. For the displaced, these currents were not abstract. They determined trains, borders, camps, documents, and futures. Some repatriations were voluntary. Others were coerced or carried out under pressure. The full history remains complex, differing by nationality, status, location, and time. But the moral wound lies in the fact that victory did not give every survivor the same freedom. Some were saved from one terror only to face another uncertainty, another authority, another demand to submit to history's next arrangement. Patton watched this new world with contempt and frustration. He saw Soviet power and wanted to confront it. His superiors saw a shattered continent and wanted to prevent another war. He saw delay as weakness. They saw his bluntness as a threat. Both perspectives contained reality. Both were shaped by fear, but only one could govern policy. The system chose restraint. Patton grew more isolated. In the autumn of 1945, he was relieved of command of the Third Army after the controversy over his public remarks and his approach to occupation. The warrior who had helped break Germany's armies was moved away from the center of power. Not long after, in December 1945, he was injured in a car accident in Germany. He died before the Cold War fully took the shape he had warned about. That timing became part of the legend. Because Patton did not live to see the Berlin blockade, NATO, Korea, Hungary, the Wall, or the long-arm silence that followed, his final warnings could be frozen in memory as unfinished prophecy. Admirers would later imagine him as the man who understood the Soviet danger before others dared speak it. Critics would remember the recklessness, the vanity, the inability to adapt to peace, the words that could have inflamed a world already soaked in blood. The truth is harder. Patton was not a secret savior betrayed by cowards. He was not merely a reckless militarist who wanted endless war. He was a commander of extraordinary ability, trapped at the edge of a new era, seeing some dangers with brutal clarity while failing to grasp others with equal depth. He understood movement, morale, shock, and fear. He understood that armies create political facts, but the post-war settlement required more than force. It required choices no battlefield genius could make clean. The prisoners' victory could not free were not only the people behind wire, in camps, on roads, or waiting beside trains. They were also the soldiers trapped inside the meaning of their own triumph. They had fought to destroy a monstrous regime, and they had succeeded. Yet beyond the ruins of Germany, another shadow was already taking shape. The alliance survived the war, trust did not. And somewhere in that uneasy silence between liberation and occupation, between justice and compromise, between Patton's anger and the world's exhaustion, the first cold breath of the next conflict moved across Europe.